Good day, it's a live report from 1789. There is chaos and anarchy here in general, the people overthrowing the government. Hey George, shoot this fortress. What's its name? Bastille. Shoot the Bastille. Alright, stop. Let's work backward a bit. What kind of bacchanal was going on right now? Well, it was the French Revolution. In short, firstly, everyone was killing each other out there, and then suddenly rights and freedoms were in the spotlight. Well, how did that happen? Well, let's start from the beginning. It was the 1780s. France was ruled by Louis XVI, who was a good and kind man. He hated luxury, loved hunting and trapping, and was maybe even a fan of fishing. Only Louis XVI was a man with an unenviable mind. At court, he was constantly pushed around by grandmothers, aunts, and high-rank noblemen. Most of all, Louis was influenced by his wife, Marie Antoinette, who decided where they should spend the state budget. But it was not a good time for ordinary people in France. There was nowhere to work, bread was getting more expensive, and alcohol prices were rising. And this, by the way, is the most important thing. It's okay to have neither a drink nor a snack. Taxes were constantly being levied from the people, and these taxes were being drunk by the rich, who ruined the country's economy. The nobles, by the way, also did not pay taxes, but the government took a good share of money from the peasant land. That's how you listen and think that this is some kind of medieval lawlessness, where people were burned at the stake and knights ran with pitchforks. But it wasn't this kind of situation at all. Just 40 years after the Revolution, the first dollar millionaire in the history of mankind would be born, John Rockefeller, and 24 years later, Henry Ford. And Nicolas Cugnot, the inventor of the first car, generally lived during the French Revolution. By the way, we have videos about each of these characters on our channel. One day, people got tired of living like animals. Hunger was raging, there was no work, the harvest was not coming. The finance minister quickly realized that people would soon storm the palace of Versailles, and therefore somehow whispered to King Louis, "Your Majesty, let's talk to the people already." The king thought and decided to call all the estates to conduct negotiations. He gathered, in short, a hall full of people. On his right hand sat the archbishops, on the left, nobles, and opposite the king sat deputies from the people. It was really a great meeting. It was conceived for the purpose that everyone could express their opinion. In fact, everyone was yelling at each other and hogged the blanket over themselves. This bacchanal was called Estates General. The people wanted to solve their problems, and the gentlemen of the aristocracy adjusted the rules to themselves. King Louis generally told the common people, "We are here deciding how to replenish the treasury, and few people are interested in your questions here." Well, the people were furious. For the first time, peasants and burghers felt the power because they were sitting opposite the king himself, who could be overthrown at any moment. The people thought of it and decided to separate. They came to Louis and said, "We are forming the National Assembly." That is what? "Now we will solve our own problems ourselves, and you generally go to hell with your votes and estates." Okay. What do you mean, okay? Will you support the National Assembly, Louis? Well, I'll think about it. Go ahead. Louis XVI thought badly at that time. His eldest son had died, and therefore he was no longer interested in state issues. The nobles and priests easily persuaded the king to their side, and when the National Assembly, a huge crowd of people, went to the Palace of Versailles, he was told, "The meeting room is not working." "What do you mean? It's under repair. Come back later." The people, however, became enraged and occupied the ballroom. A furious crowd tried to get Louis to approve the Constitution, which would ensure everyone would be equal before the law, taxes would be paid, etc. And then Louis made a fatal mistake. The king told the people, "Get out of my house." It's not enough that Louis kicked the people out of the Palace of Versailles, he introduced mercenaries into Paris, and not just mercenaries, but foreigners, whom the French hated fiercely. And then people lost patience. Everybody billed them for a long time and then tried to crush them with foreigners. Bread had risen in price again, there was nothing to eat, cows were dying, and Louis, you see, also dismissed the finance minister who was entrusted with saving France. And then chaos began. Parisians smashed up mercenaries, huge crowds flooded the streets, chaos, anarchy, everything we love. Even the French generals came over to the side of the crowd. The government enraged absolutely everyone, and the soldiers were no exception. The people stormed gun shops, destroyed the houses of the rich, and the slogan thundered ahead of the crowd, "To arms, to arms." As a result, people captured 32,000 guns, but there was nothing to shoot with. There was no gunpowder. And then on the morning of July 14th, 1789, the people moved to capture Bastille, a fortress where political prisoners were held. Actually, there were only 7 people in prison there, but no one cared. The people wanted to feel the taste of victory. Fight the regime, fight against the government. A huge crowd rushed to Bastille. 98 men were killed during the assault, but the advantage was on the side of the people. The fortress garrison catapulted. 7 of its members were torn to people by the crowd. Someone will say, "Holy shit, they made a real mess of things there." And I'll say, this is just the beginning. Yes, the capture of Bastille is considered only the first day of the French Revolution, and the main bacchanal was still ahead. Louis realized that he had been yanked out from behind the steering wheel. If earlier he was manipulated by the palace nobility, now he had to make concessions to the people. The king recognized the National Assembly. By the way, it managed to become the National Constituent Assembly. There is no difference, in fact, it just sounds cooler that way. Louis also gave the green light to make a militia out of the people. They recruited all sorts of rabble there and put Marquis de Lafayette at the head of this unit. The name is beautiful, Lafayette. And why is this name familiar, by the way? In short, Gilbert Lafayette first fought in the USA. He was there side by side with George Washington, struggling with the southern United States. In general, there was a man who was a really tough guy, and Louis put this man in charge of the people's militia. This way, in fact, he signed his death sentence. But that was not enough. Concessions were concessions, but the Parisians had nothing to eat. The fact is that the French peasants really did not want to deliver bread to Paris. You never know what kind of turmoil is going on there. Everybody could just take the bread away. Well, the Parisians decided to poke the authorities with a stick. Who should they poke? Right, Louis. On October 5th, 1779, a small horde came to Louis. The people's militia and hungry people arrived at the Palace of Versailles, and Lafayette was at the head of this crowd. At first, they shouted, "Bread for us, bread!" And then they said to the king, "Let's go with us to Paris, and there we will tell you what to do." Well, Louis turned out to be a hostage. What was he supposed to say? No, I'm not going? The situation was kind of moronic. Everybody could manipulate the king, and of course, he no longer represented authority. Louis was sick of the whole situation and decided to take his family, disguise himself as a servant, and cross the border under the guise of Russians in order to leave the country unnoticed. This plot could be more interesting than all James Bonds. Louis drove away but did not leave the country. The king was identified by the postmaster, the carriage was caught up, and returned back in front of the people. I don't know what Louis had to do after that. I would have shot myself, but the king had a stronger character than me. Furthermore, so far the king has completely lost his authority, which means you can do what you want and not be afraid anybody will come for you. Therefore, people hastily gathered a national convention, well, a new government, and declared France a republic. And this is a really significant step. There is no longer just a declaration of rights of man and the citizen, there is also the sovereignty of the nation, public assistance, public education. In general, all the pathetic words that we hear on the morning television. In the new Constitution, it was written that everyone can say what they want, the law is the same for everybody, etc., and so on, but in reality, everything was different. So what do you think happened? That's right, everyone started to fight with each other again. Why? Well, there was no strong government in the country, again. The fact is that the Constitutional Assembly got a little tired of ruling the country. The deputies adopted the Constitution, but after that, they resigned from their posts. They said, "We've done our job and we're too old for this shit." And France, in fact, was left without a government. Well, everything turned back. Loudspeakers again began to shout slogans, people rushed from one party to another. In general, everybody lied to each other, and this is still an era of the absence of the internet. While the political parties were shouting at each other at meetings, the war began, which, fantastic. This is exactly what people lacked for complete happiness. The trouble started because someone wanted to save the king and others to, not let him be saved. And while everybody was beating each other up, other countries had their eye on France. So there was the Holy Roman Empire at the time. It hastily agreed with Prussia. And then one day these two formidable countries got up their steam and said, "Hey, the French, we will come to you. We will drink tea and seize the power. Do you agree?" I would say that France answered them, but YouTube does not like such expressions very much. And it doesn't matter what they said. It is important that the war has begun. The king's supporters put together a pretty good army and threw it in their own country to rescue Louis from prison. Prussia and the Roman Empire had thrown their forces. It turned out that the French were forced to fight not only against foreign invaders, but also against their own people, and nobody really liked it. The people became even hungrier and angrier. A fierce lawlessness was going on in the government. The Jacobins, the Girondins were fighting for power. In fact, it doesn't matter what the whole thing was called. It's important that they tore at each other's throats, and the country suffered because of it. And the political parties decided to lay the blame on somebody so that people would not look after them too much. So who do you think became the scapegoat? In 1792, the Louis Palace was broken into. It was revolutionaries who quickly found the correspondence of the king with the Austrians, and it was written there, "Seize France and don't forget to release me." For Louis, that was the end. On January 23rd, 1793, the king was elevated to a scaffold. There was a guillotine there. Louis behaved calmly and with dignity, but it did not help him. His head was cut off, and then a fierce lawlessness began. Other countries began to yell and saying, "Are you absolutely nuts killing the king?" And a coalition gathered against France. Simply put, they gathered in a crowd against the country and began to beat it up. France didn't have many enemies, 1, 2, 3, well, enough that I can't count. Among the enemies were England, Prussia, Portugal, Spain, Austria, Holland, and a couple of other foreign principalities who wanted to cut off a piece for themselves. In general, France is not to be envied here, but that wasn't the worst thing. Remember I mentioned the party of Jacobins? So these guys were committed to democracy. They had the slogan freedom, equality, fraternity, which sounded beautiful, but in fact, the Jacobins did what they wanted. The Jacobins had enemies, the Girondins. Do you know how the former differed from the latter? Not at all. Some advocated for freedom and the second did the same. It's just that the Jacobins were smarter and this played a decisive role. At first, the confrontation was quite cultural. Jacobins and Girondins gathered in large halls, shouted at each other, and then quietly dispersed. Then everybody got tired of that, and slowly the terror began. Jacobins started shouting not in offices but on the streets, accusing Girondins of being traitors, arrested them, and threw them out of the government. While everyone was thinking, how is that possible, Jacobins quickly seized power and then began to chop off everybody's heads. Maximilien Robespierre ran those guys. What a terrible name, but his deeds were worse. Robespierre decided to execute Louis's wife first, and then start chopping off everybody's heads, so there would be fewer traitors, of course. Now anyone could be executed, even someone who was not on anybody's side, because you're either with us or you're with them, so we'll kill you and then we'll figure it out. Robespierre even killed his own comrades in arms. For some reason, he thought that some Jacobins were not Jacobin enough, and therefore could be called traitors. In short, freedom, equality, fraternity went a little beyond the scope. In fact, Jacobins were more suited to the slogan, "We do what we want to do." Now, this couldn't last for long, and a conspiracy quickly matured against Robespierre. The conspirator raked him, dragged him out, and executed him on the guillotine. As people say, the chickens had come home to roost, and it would be great if the story ended there. The political squabble continued. A new coup d'etat took place, someone managed to escape, someone did not, and in general, everything was usual. All this would go on indefinitely if it wasn't for one person. Now maybe you've already guessed who I'm talking about. You might think this is some kind of chopstick that somehow ended up on our video, but no, it's not a chopstick. This is Napoleon Bonaparte. The one who recognized him liked this video, and the ones who didn't recognize him subscribe to the channel to know the history. Awesome. So, how did Napoleon come to power? In short, he was reputed to be a great authority because it was he who raised the army from fool to fool, led it through Italy and Egypt, and suppressed an uprising in his native country. In general, Napoleon was reputed to be a tough guy, but he lacked one thing: power. Then the chance turned up. In the Directory, the government at the time, a coup was brewing. Some wanted to frame others, but they lacked a strong hand, so they sent for Bonaparte. They came to Napoleon and asked, "Listen, can you help us arrange a coup d'etat?" "Yes, no problem." "Great. Now you'll have to wait until the right people are removed from their post, and you can knock down the rest. Don't be shy." On November 9, 1799, Napoleon broke into the Council of Elders. The sight of armed men scared the locals very much, so first Bonaparte was carried out on his hands, and then he knocked everyone out in response. They called it the coup of 18 Brumaire, and Napoleon Bonaparte became the ruler of France. Now what did Napoleon do? Well, nothing unique. He just invented a code that eliminated the differences between a peasant and a nobleman. He just created an education system that was divided into primary, secondary, and higher. He created a Bank of France and reformed taxation. Now somebody today would say that Napoleon was a fool. After all, he eventually lost the war. And I would say, look at the map. Yeah, in 1812 it was France. Half of Europe, after all. Yes, there were huge sacrifices behind the name Napoleon, but it's not for us to judge a man who died a long time ago. Instead, better to learn from the mistakes of history. Therefore, we will remember all those who are not with us. We will continue to move forward. Good luck to you, dear viewer. Let's remember the French Revolution and swear that this should not happen again.